Hello, and welcome back to our IELTS preparation video series here at First English. In this video, we're going to be tackling the common question types that you can expect to face in part one of the speaking portion of the exam. And we'll be breaking down exactly what you need to know to answer these questions sufficiently. So let's jump into it. So in this part of the exam, as mentioned here in the material, you can follow along too. It's going to begin with a short introduction from the examiner where they're going to inspect and check the candidates or your identification, and then proceed with this part of the exam as an interview or in an interview kind of manner. So this portion of the exam is going to last about 5 minutes and will usually contain about 6 to 12 questions approximately. So the questions for this part of the exam will be basic questions in general, focused on familiar topics such as your background, your hobbies, your interests, your routines, your lifestyle, your habits, so on and so forth. Now, obviously, these questions themselves can range widely on the topics or their contents in which they're asking about. You might get one question, for example, to describe something about your city, and then the next question might be something about an animal that you like. But all the questions in general, or all the questions to be potentially asked essentially, will be congruent to specific question types. And the structure, style, and manner in which you should answer these questions will generally be the same. And that's exactly what we're going to break down and describe today. So I bet some of you are still wondering at this point. Well, before I get into that, it's important to follow this rule essentially. Your answers should be in long response with plenty of linking phrases, complex sentences, and then redundant language. Now, at this point, before we continue, I bet some of you are still a bit confused as to what I mean when I keep repeating the word linking phrase. Well, to give you a very basic example of words that are linking phrases, or what linking phrases are essentially, is let's look at the word and. So and, of course, is a conjunction, of course, right? And what and does is connect two sentences or ideas together. And that's exactly what you're looking to do when you include linking words and linking phrases in your answers during the exam. Correct transitions, connections, and signposting of all the content or all the inclusions in your answers into nice, long, complex, um, while still coherent sentences, of course. And is a very basic way of connecting sentences, of course, just as other conjunctions are, like um, we have but, yet, or, so. These are all basic, very basic conjunctions which do the exact same thing. Like I mentioned, connect and transition your statements or your ideas in your sentences. Um, but I'll be giving you a host of linking phrases and examples of what to use in your answers so that you can look into the structure of each question type and provide the appropriate answer for each question that you get asked. Okay, so on that note, let's jump into the first question type here, which is going to be basic description type questions. Now, before we go into the structure here and talk about the linking phrases and so on and so forth, I want to mention one very important piece of information that relates to all of the questions, the question types, and the questions that you can expect really at any point in the exam. And that is, for example, a basic description type question could be something like, what is your city like? What is your work? What is your study like? So on and so forth. Now, the examiner in this situation is not interested in what your life is like, or what your city is actually like, or what you do for work, or what you study. Instead, they're asking through these type of questions, show me your ability to describe something, describe a place, describe your work, describe your habits, something along those lines, and use good vocabulary in doing so. So what happens with a lot of students or a lot of candidates who are taking the exam is they will get caught up in trying to provide correct and factual information in their answers. So they might begin very strongly by saying something about their city and then get lost at some point when they run out of things to say, essentially. You're not going to be graded or you're not going to be scored on the things that you include or the factuality of the facts that you include in your answers. Instead, you're going to be graded on the manner and way in which you articulate the points that you make, the details in which you give, so on and so forth. So that's a very important thing to mention, or a very important thing to keep in mind. Don't get caught up. Don't get too distracted by trying to include things that are correct, factual, like pulled straight from a dictionary. You can honestly be saying absolute, just ludicrous information as long as it's said in the right structure, in the right manner, with nice, redundant, long, complex sentences with plenty of linking phrases, so on and so forth. You're going to get that 7 or 8 band, which you're aiming for, I assume. So in any case, I'll bring that up again. I'll reiterate that point because it's very important, and a lot of people forget that as we go through some of these question types and so on. But let's look at the structure now of how to answer a basic description style or type question. In fact, before we do that, let's look at an example of some answers or some responses that people would give to this style of question. So let's say somebody gets asked the question, tell me about your city or describe your city to me. What is your city like? An example of an average response would be something like, I come from Beijing. I am native to the city. Beijing is the capital of China. In Beijing, there are many historical buildings. Beijing duck is very famous, and I always eat it with my friends. Now, of course, looking at this answer, it is perfectly grammatically correct. It makes sense. It provides a good amount of detail and so on. But remember, when getting asked any of these types of questions, essentially, the examiner is looking at your ability to answer these questions in a complex manner, provide or describe, in this case, basic description type questions, your ability to describe something. Describe your city, describe whatever is being asked of you in this case. So the problem with an answer like this, although being grammatically correct and perfectly understandable, is that it is too short, it's very direct, doesn't contain any linking words, any linking phrases. There's no redundant language. There's no examples of uncommon or complex vocabulary. There's no idiomatic language. Grammar is pretty basic, and the tense is pretty standard throughout the entire answer. So this isn't what you should be aiming for when you provide any of your answers, let alone this particular question type. So let's now break down the exact structure in which you should provide or articulate your answers when getting asked similar questions to this. So first and foremost, you're going to want to have an introductory sentence. Instead of straight up going into your answer and saying, I am from this city, you want to introduce or signpost or kind of segue what you're going to say into your first point or into the first content of your answer. So an example of that introductory sentence or lead-in phrase could be something very simple like, well, okay then, well, first of all, something very simple as to that, which again kind of signifies that you're beginning your answer. And then you're going to continue on by saying the city, in this case, because we're using the example of what's your city like, the city I would like to talk about is Beijing. So that whole phrase is going to be, well, first of all, the city I would like to talk about is Beijing. So that's going to be our lead-in phrase. And note that's a phrase. That's not the end of our first sentence. We're going to continue that sentence into the next part of our answer with a linking phrase. This is where those linking phrases come in. And note how each of the linking phrases that we have as examples here all begin with the word and. Because like I said, the conjunction and does exactly what a linking phrase does, connects the ideas or connects the points in a sentence coherently. So some examples of some linking phrases that you can use would be, and the point I would like to begin with is that, and the first thing that I should mention is that, and my initial point would be that, so on and so forth. I think you get the picture. Of course, you're not limited to just using linking phrases such as this. You can make up your own, you can include what you want in terms of your linking phrase, but it just has to have that main focus or that theme of connecting your introductory statement into your first point of your answer. So our answer thus far would be something like, well, first of all, the city I would like to talk about is Beijing. And the first point I would like to begin with is that Beijing is a city with an incredibly rich history. Now, even at that point, we aren't done with our first sentence. We're going to continue our first sentence. We've just stated our first point in our opening sentence, and now we're going to transition into our reason or explanation supporting that point or explaining why we brought up that point. So we're going to continue here with another linking phrase, you guessed it. Some examples of a linking phrase you can use at this point, because the linking phrases will differ somewhat depending on which point or where they're put in the sentence. So do note that. You can see how these linking phrases are slightly different to the ones that we used up here. But some examples to continue with would be, and this is due to the fact that, and this is most likely because. So to continue that same sentence with another linking phrase, we would say something like, I'll say the whole sentence here now. Well, first of all, the city I would like to talk about is Beijing. And the first point I would like to begin with is that Beijing is a city with an incredibly rich history. And this is likely due to the fact that Beijing, as a metropolis, is in fact 60,000 years old. Now, some of you, especially if you might be from Beijing or know anything about the city, as you can tell, I don't, would know that that probably isn't correct. I doubt Beijing is actually 60,000 years old. But that reflects the point that the contents in your answer, the contents or facts that you're going to include in your points, in your reasons, and so on, do not have to be correct. Again, the examiner is not going to pull up a dictionary, all right, or a resource to verify the information that you're providing. Instead, they're going to be grading you on the 4 criteria, the 4 structures that we mentioned in our last video: fluency and coherence, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, and pronunciation. So those are going to be our focus or the points to look at and focus on in creating any of our answers. But in any case, going back to our example sentence there, that would be the completion of our first sentence now. So we've completed our first sentence. Notice how that was very complex, very long-winded almost. And I know the difficulty herein lies is that this isn't, for most people at least, a common way of communicating verbally or articulating your ideas and points in a verbal manner. It almost sounds kind of like a book, or how things are kind of exemplified and written out in formal language and so on. But this is the style and the mannerism which you need to adopt and get familiar with to provide the right criteria or the right input, the right things for you to hit all the marks that you're aiming for in each of the criteria that you're going to be assessed on, those 4 criteria I just mentioned. So now that we've completed our first sentence in our answer, we want to continue with another sentence. In each and every one of your answers, you essentially want to use at least 1 to 3 points and reasons. It's going to differ somewhat between answers or between question types, but that's kind of the safe zone. 1 to 3, 1, 2, or 3 points and then reasons in all of your answers. Some might only use 1 or 2. Some might have the opportunity to go into 3. We don't have to get that long-winded, of course. We don't have to provide too long of an answer, but essentially that's the kind of structure that we need to follow. So let's look now at a better response, an example of a better response here for a question such as this. So, well, as you can probably guess, I come from Beijing. I have lived here all my life, although at this moment I am studying in another city, Tianjin. I suppose if I had to describe Beijing, the first thing I would say is that it is absolutely enormous, maybe even one of the biggest cities in Asia. I guess it's so big, in fact, that even the locals have problems finding their way around. Another significant characteristic is that it offers examples of both classical and contemporary architecture. Actually, some of China's most renowned landmarks are slap bang in the middle of Beijing. So as you can see there, that answer is obviously a lot, follows the structure almost to a T, and is a much better response than the initial answer that we looked over with the simple direct sentences and so on. So again, this is just a suggested structure. By following this structure, you are going to be hitting the points that you need to maintain with all 4 of the assessment categories. That's why we encourage and promote this type of structure. It's essentially what we employ in every one of our question types. So let me write down the formula here so you can follow along as we continue on with some of the other question types, because the formula or the structure will essentially remain the same through any one of the 7 question types which we'll be talking about. But it's going to start with an intro, or introductory, if you will, introductory phrase or sentence. And then we're going to continue with a linking phrase into our first point, our primary point. And again, that's not the end of our sentence. We are then going to follow through with another linking phrase. Remember, all these linking phrases are just transitioning from each point to our next reason, and so on at any point in our sentence. So another linking phrase into our first reason, and then that is going to conclude our first sentence. So again, here for a basic descriptions type question, it is suggested to include at least one or two, potentially three points and reasons. So to do that, we would have another opening or lead-in linking phrase is essentially what it is, but it's introductory, it's an opening phrase. Right? And that's going to be our linking phrase. So we'll continue right into our second point, then continuing with another linking phrase, right? And lastly, following that with our second reason, okay? And again, I just want to point out that you don't need to get hung up on the points and the reasons that you're going to include. Don't be focused too much on providing factual, correct information. It can be absolute cockamamie, to be completely honest with you, as long as it's relevant and coherent with the question and answers the question to that extent. But it doesn't have to be factual, like I mentioned. Okay. And that's the structure that we're going to be following. Like I said, for most of these question types, this is essentially the structure that you're going to want to follow. It does vary, it does differ somewhat as you proceed through some of the other question types, which of course we'll talk about and break down here. And on that note, let's move on to the second question type, which is liking. So an example of that kind of question would be, do you like animals? Pretty straightforward, pretty basic now. So again, before we go into the structure here, let's just talk about a bad response to a liking style question. So let's say, for example, you can ask that, do you like animals? A bad response would be something like this. So do you like animals? If you were to answer, I like animals, especially cats. They are very good pets, and I have 2 of them at home. So again, I mean, I understand that that is a grammatically correct response and it looks appropriate in terms of answering the question. But remember, with each and every one of these question types that are being employed or being asked by the examiner, they're essentially questioning or checking your ability to describe, to talk about, to expand upon, to expound on the particular styles or types of questions that you get asked. So a question like this wouldn't exactly be sufficient if you're aiming for a 7, 6, 7, or even an 8 band. It's too short, too direct, lacks complexity, so on and so forth. So in any case, let's break down the structure now of question type 2, these liking style questions. So first up, the first step you want to do is find some alternative language for liking. With any one of these questions, you don't necessarily want to repeat the phrasing or the wording of the question exactly. If you have the opportunity to change up the way a question's worded when you're answering the question or in your answer, take that opportunity and definitely employ that. You don't want to essentially just be repeating exactly what the question words. So do you like animals? You don't want to say, I like animals that, or something like that. You want to instead use some creative language. Like in this example here, we have quite a few examples of some alternative or interchangeable phrases for liking, such as, I am fairly keen on, or I am pretty keen on, I'm really into, I'm quite a big fan of, I simply adore, so on and so forth. So you want to take the opportunity to use alternative language or alternative phrasing such as that. So now jumping into the structure, it's a bit shorter than the basic description type questions. We only have three notable points here to compose our answer. But just like the initial or the last question type, it's going to begin with an introductory or lead-in phrase, an introductory sentence. And we're going to use our introductory sentence to obviously lead into our answer by saying something like, well, in general, I would say, actually, I suppose for the most part, I would probably say that. Well, to be honest, I should really say that, so on and so forth. And there's a couple other examples here. Again, these are just examples that you can, in fact, take away and use in your own answers, or at least use as a reference to create your own linking phrases. It's also important to note that in using these linking phrases, we're going to be answering, remember, 6 to 12 questions during this part of the exam. We don't want to necessarily repeat too many of the same linking phrases. So a good suggestion is get familiar with quite a variety of the various linking phrases that you're going to need to use and produce and provide in your sentences. So, and get used to being able to articulate the same phrase a little differently, if that makes sense. I'll explain a couple examples of that maybe later on. But then after mentioning that introductory sentence, going back to the structure here, we're going to want to talk about the specific, or we're going to give a specific example of answering the question. So we can say something like, again, leading into another linking phrase here, but in particular, you can just say specifically, which is a linking phrase in and of itself, to be more precise, to be more exact, to be more accurate, something along those lines. So at this point, our answer should sound something like, well, in general, I would have to say that I do like animals, but in particular, I would say something along those lines. I like a particular animal. You would want to say a specific, I like cats or I like dogs. And then you're going to obviously transition now into your reason because we just mentioned our point. And our reason is going to lead in with a linking phrase. Something like, this could be because, this might be because, this is due to the fact that, this is attributed to, so on and so forth. I think you're starting to get the idea, right? But let's look at an example response. You can notice that this example response is quite a bit shorter. We don't need to include too many points here, but instead of answering the question very basically like, I do like animals, I like cats, we're providing a nice, complex, well-worded sentence here following the structure that I just went over in saying something like, well, in general, I would say that I am pretty fond of animals, and to be more precise, I'm especially passionate about dogs. And this could be because they are very loyal and intelligent animals. So hopefully that makes sense and gives you a good idea on how to answer liking style questions. Probably one of the more simple question types to expect in part one of the exam, but still a question type that you need to prepare for in terms of familiarizing yourself with the appropriate structure in composing your answer. So moving on to question type 3 here, disliking, just on the other side of the coin as to liking questions. So an example of this would be, do you dislike fast foods, or do you dislike any animals? Something along those lines. So just like in the previous question type, we want to find some alternative language to disliking. We don't necessarily want to just reiterate or repeat disliking in our particular answer. So we want to say something like, I'm not so keen on, I'm not very much a fan of, I totally detest. All of these phrases are essentially interchangeable. Some of them might have a little bit more connotation than others. Like I totally detest goes a little bit beyond saying you dislike something. But if you truly do detest something, take the opportunity to use that complex language. Absolutely. I absolutely loathe, another quite extreme or very firm way of saying disliking. I really can't stand is a bit of a softer way of saying the same sort of mannerism. But in any case, obviously, since it's essentially the exact same question as liking, just the antonym of it, the structure is going to be essentially the same as well. We're going to have introduction sentence. We're going to talk about the specific, and then provide a reason behind that. So an example could be something with a lead-in phrase sounding like, actually, I suppose that for the most part, I would say that. You would obviously answer the question, I do, or I totally detest fast food. Then obviously we're going to lead in or use a linking phrase to talk about the specific. But in particular, I particularly despise McDonald's. Or, you don't have to use a particular example. You could say a style of food, hamburgers, or so on and so forth. This actually brings up a good point that I would like to make. When giving any of your answers, try your best not to be too specific when it's not necessary. So like for the example of that I just mentioned, I totally detest fast food, but in particular, I despise McDonald's. We're talking about a very specific situation now, a very specific circumstance. So now all of the rest of our answer is essentially going to have to relate to McDonald's, isn't it? So if you speak a little bit more generally and say, I totally detest fast food, but in particular, I despise hamburgers, that might provide you a little bit more room or a little bit more, I guess, area to work with, right? If that kind of makes sense. I've seen a lot of people, especially in composing their answers, kind of dig themselves into a hole by speaking too specifically too early on, and it doesn't leave them with much wiggle room or much room to talk about anything else. So just keep that in mind. If you can speak generally, try your best to do so. Only be specific when necessary. Because again, we're not being graded by the content. We're being graded or marked in the way that you can describe and the structure that you follow um, in the articulation of your sentences or your answers, if that makes sense. So again, after following the specific and mentioning that, we're going to transition into our reason, right? So an example of, or a good example of a response to a disliking style question would be something like, well, in general, I would say that I'm not much a fan of animals, and to be more precise, I especially can't stand dogs. This could be because they bark extremely loud and are often dangerous animals. Another example that we have here in the material would be, of course, I think that I'd have to say I'm not so keen on the weather, and to be more precise, I can't stand the summer months. This is due to the fact that the temperature can get as high as 40 degrees, so it can be quite uncomfortable if you don't have air conditioning in your home. In addition to this, I'm not really that fond of the public transportation system. I guess this is probably because the buses are too old and the seats are hard, so long journeys are usually bumpy. Okay. So there's an example of a disliking question or disliking response following that appropriate structure. So now we're going to move on to the structure of question type number 4, or types of questions. So an example of this would be, or example of this style of question would be something like, tell me about the different types of public transportation in your city, or tell me about the different types of food in your country. So an important thing to note here is you don't want to repeat the adjective that's used in the question, or at least you want to find some alternative or some synonyms to the adjective used or mentioned in the question initially. So obviously the adjective used in the question here is different. Different types of public transportation, different types of food. So we want to find some alternative language or some alternative phrasing to say that same thing. So we could say things like, let me write them out here. Some alternative or synonyms to different would be alternative, right? Alternative types of public transportation, of alternative types of food. Differing. I mean, it sounds like different, but it is a different word. Differing, contrasting. What are some other ones? We have some other examples could be like varied, ranging, so on and so forth. So these are all synonyms to different. And when using the same or similar adjective in your answer, you want to try to use some of that alternative phrasing. You don't want to necessarily just repeat or be too redundant in using the exact same adjective. But again, as you could probably have guessed, this structure is going to continue along the exact same lines as what we've already talked about. We're going to have an introductory sentence. And here, it's also important to note that we want to be a little broad, right, by saying there are different types of whatever the question is asking. And so we're going to start our response by saying, of course, as you may know, there are quite a mixed variety of, well, actually, there is a fairly broad range of, okay, certainly there are quite a range of, so on and so forth. So we're going to obviously state what the question is answering. So, of course, as you may know, there are quite a mixed variety of public transportation options in my city. And then we're going to lead in following the structure to introduce the first type, right? Because the question is, this question type is types of, so we're going to be describing at least two, talking about at least two in our answer. So we're going to start with the main type, or the first type we're going to talk about. So we're going to use an introductory, it's a linking phrase, but it's going to introduce the first type that we're going to be speaking about in our answer. So we're going to say, but I guess the most, and we're going to include an adjective here, we could say something like common, but I guess the most common would be buses or subways or whatever it is in your city. Again, the content doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Just pick one and run with it. But here's some examples of some adjectives that you could use. You could say common, popular, fashionable, famous, widely used, important, standard, usual, so on and so forth. You can even create your own, obviously. In providing you this structure, we are not requiring you to stick to it appropriate or stick to it exactly, obviously, but we can attest that following the structure will contribute necessary attributes that you need to have in your answer to maintain or to achieve the kind of band that you're looking for. And we have the 4 assessment criteria. Using the structure is going to cover all 4 of those. Okay. So in any case, we're going to use another linking phrase, right? After we've stated our point or we've stated our first type in the question or to answer the question. Now we're going to lead into our reason behind mentioning or stating that type. So you're going to say something like, and the thing is with buses is that, so on and so forth. And I assume buses are so common because, so on and so forth, right? So notice how with a lot of these answers that you're creating, the majority of the answer is really going to be linking phrases to transitionary statements, those things that are going to connect your points, your reasons, your ideas, the statements that you're making together. The content in itself is going to be quite short uh, and sometimes concise, which is what you want to see. You want to follow this nice complex manner in providing or producing your sentences or producing your answers with somewhat direct and concise information, just to keep everything as simple and complex as possible, if that makes sense. What I mean by that here is in the example, let me read off the example first off. The example answer to this would be, of course, as you may know, there is quite a mixed variety of public transportation in my city, but I guess the most popular would be subways. And the thing with subways is that they are extremely convenient and on time, as well as subways. Another widely used transport are buses, and I think they're also very popular due to the fact that they are also very cheap. So notice here, I mean, we have the introductory phrases, the linking phrases, and everything else in that nature highlighted in red. So almost half of our answer, if not half of our answer, is just linking phrases and just those connective phrases and so on to just bring our answer together and help it flow very naturally and very appropriately. So again, this is the kind of structure that we want to follow to maintain that complexity. I know I keep reiterating it, but again, it's not a super familiar way that a lot of us are used to speaking. So by constantly reiterating it, constantly focusing on how to create it and how to articulate it yourself, you will ultimately get more familiar with it and be comfortable in speaking in this sort of way, which is obviously going to be required of you in the speaking portion of the exam, right? In any case, let's move on to the next question type here, which is I call them the WH or how often questions. I say WH because it means how, or sorry, when, where, why, those type of questions, those questions that begin with WH, and how often questions. So this question type is going to be quite common in part 1. You're going to be asked oftentimes, or you're going to be asked, for example, how often do you go to the cinema? Where do you usually buy your clothes? What music do you listen to? Or when do you listen to music? So on and so forth. So the kind of trap or the issue that a lot of people might fall into when answering these kinds of questions is that they will provide very direct and information-focused responses. For example, 90% of candidates taking the exam might say something like, I go to the cinemas every week because I love watching movies. And that, again, in and of itself answers the question, but I'm sure you at this point following along could say that that question is too direct, too short, lacks linking phrases, lacks complexity, all that other good jazz that you need to include, right? So it's good to answer these styles of questions with 2 or 3 different responses. Or what I mean by that is describing 2 or 3 different scenarios or situations which answer the question overall. So before we look at the example response, or actually I think it would be a good idea to look at the example response first before breaking down the structure so I can give you a better idea what I mean when I say describe 2 or 3 different scenarios. So an example response, a good example response to this style or question type would be, well, to be honest, I think I would have to say that it really depends on the situation. Like for instance, if I have the money, then it is quite possible that I will watch a movie in a cinema 2 or 3 times a month. You know, cinema tickets are pretty pricey in China. Whereas in contrast, if I am broke, it is more likely that I will watch movies at home on DVD. As as you are most likely aware, DVDs are quite cheap here, especially compared to the price of a cinema ticket. So notice how in that answer, obviously answers the question very well, but he or she, whoever's providing this answer, describes two specific situations or scenarios in which he answers the question appropriately. So to break down the structure of how you would do that, like you guessed, we're going to have an introductory sentence, an introductory phrase, and this phrase is going to revolve or focus on saying that it depends on the situation. So it's going to start by saying something like, to be honest, actually, to be fair, or in actual fact. Now we're going to link up to one of those dependent phrases or dependent scenarios. So you would say something to lead into that by, or something like, I would have to say that it really depends on. I would suppose I would have to mention, I would have to maintain that it kind of depends really, so on and so forth. And now we're going to mention situation A, or the first scenario which we're going to describe. Like for instance, in the example, he states, right? Where is it? If I have the money, that kind of specifies the first scenario. It is quite possible that I will watch movies in the cinema 2 or 3 times a week. And then he provides another linking phrase, as noted here, to provide um, the reason behind that scenario. Tickets are pretty pricey in China, so on and so forth. Right? So then we're going to transition now into our second situation, our situation B, right? By using something that says, whereas in contrast, whereas on the other hand, though at the same time, on the other side of the coin, so on and so forth. And then we're going to use the exact same structure to answer or describe scenario B, or the second situation, right? By using the dependent phrase, or the linking phrase that describes the dependent phrase, and then the point behind situation B, and then the reason for stating situation B, or the outcome is essentially what the structure follows. So this question type can get a little complex, or a little bit hard to follow. Especially if you're doing this for the first time. So just remember that in answering this, instead of being too direct and providing too simple of an answer, try your best to describe at least two scenarios. Okay, moving on. So we have our second to last question type here, which are yes and no type questions. Some examples would be like, do people wear special clothes at weddings in your country? Do you think fast food is popular in your country? Is eating healthy important? These are all yes and no style questions. Now, saying yes and no up front and explaining your answer isn't wrong, but in maintaining one standpoint in your answer by just maintaining the yes or the no standpoint in your answer, it can be easy to provide too simple of an answer, especially in terms of grammar structure. You could lack the essential linking phrases to make your answer appropriate for reaching that 7 band. So a better way to answer it, if possible, is to answer both yes and no. Kind of similar to the last question type, how WH type questions, question type 5, we want to use the contrasting scenarios or contrasting explanations behind the answer to help add complexity to our answer. Again, don't be hung up too much on whether or not you agree with the yes or no. We're just trying to answer this question in providing enough detail and complexity to achieve that band that we're looking for, right? So an example response, just like how we did in the last question type. Let me read the example response, and then we'll go into the structure. A good example response to a question like this would be, well, in actual fact, if I think about it, I guess that in many ways it's fairly important to agree that healthy eating is important, especially when you consider that a healthy diet can help prevent a variety of diseases and health problems such as diabetes and obesity. But you should also have to understand, but you also have to understand that eating unhealthy food in moderation is not overly harmful. In fact, unhealthy food is often tastier than healthier food, so I guess it's fine to eat a little junk food now and then. So all in all, I guess my answer would have to be both yes and no. So notice how they have those contrasting points, right, or perspectives in that answer, and it provides an opportunity to produce a very complex, long-winded, and well-descripted answer. So that's what we're looking for when answering yes and no style questions. So the structure to follow in particular would be to essentially describe the positions of both a yes and no response. So we're going to have an opening phrase for our yes response. Just like in the example, they said something like, well, in actual fact, if you think about it, I guess that in many ways. Another opening phrase you could use would be, well, certainly in some ways, so on and so forth. Then you were going to link into your first statement. It is fairly important to agree that eating healthy is important, just like was mentioned in the example phrase. Then we're going to develop this statement with supporting details, just like, I mean, it's a little bit more in depth than our basic formula here, but it's essentially the same scenario, right? Our introductory phrase describing our first position with our yes response, our linking phrase into our first point that's going to develop that position, right? Our linking phrase into our first reason, solidifying that first perspective or that first position with the yes response. And then we're going to transition into our no response, you guessed it, with a linking phrase, a lead-in phrase. And then we're going to transition into our second point, supporting or exemplifying that no response, that no position. And then we're going to use a linking phrase to round off or summarize with our reason as well as our conclusion to our answer overall. So I guess I would have to say that my response would be both yes and no. I'm not going over each and every one of these linking phrases because, as you could guess, they're all pretty similar to even the other ones that we've covered in some of our other question types. And like I said, we're not limiting you. You're not limited to just using these particular linking phrases. So long as you get the gist or the idea that you want to follow and persuade in providing your answers, you want to just use appropriate linking phrases and appropriate transitions to fill in and segue into the following point or statement that you're going to make in your answer. So these are just examples for you to follow. You can perfectly well take these and use them in your actual answers, but you're not required to stick to these exactly. We would just want to use linking phrases or transitionary statements which follow these same lines. Okay. So that is question type number 6, and that leads us into the last question type, probably one of the more simple question types, I would say, which are would questions or would type questions. So for would type questions, an example question would be something like, would you move to another city in the future? Would you like to change your job? Would you live near the sea? Would you like to learn a foreign language? So when the examiner is asking these types of questions, again, they're not looking for your actual answer. They're not looking for how honest you're going to be in terms of what you actually feel. They're looking at one particular aspect when asking would type questions, and that is grammar, the aspect of grammar in your response, in your answer. So the basic rule of thumb is that when a question uses would, you're going to need to include at least one example of would or might consider, right, prospecting the future tense in your answer. So the structure is pretty simple. We're going to begin your sentence with one of these, you guessed it, introductory phrases or lead-in linking phrases. Something like, well, quite honestly, I don't think I've ever thought about that, but I guess, actually, this isn't something that I have ever considered, but in short, right, that's a nice opening linking phrase to lead into your ultimate answer here, which is going to continue by saying, or continue by putting in your conditional tense phrase, which is going to be if, right, past simple, and something like I would, I could, I might, the infinitive verb, I move, live, whatever it might be, and then the example answering, or then your response answering the question, obviously. So an example would be something like, if I lived near the sea, I might be able to eat fresh seafood, or if I had the time, I would go for traveling, something along those lines. So an overall response, which I put together a bit earlier, would be just copy and paste to make it easy here. So I guess the copy and paste wasn't too kind to the formatting here. Let me just adjust it a little bit so we can read the entire thing. But this is how our response would look like for this question type. Well, quite honestly, I don't think I've ever thought about that, but I guess if I had the opportunity to relocate somewhere, I would decide to live near the sea. so I would be able to eat fresh seafood and enjoy the calming ocean waves on a daily basis. So again, this is one of the simpler type of questions, but in asking this type of question, the examiner is really focusing on the grammar, functionality, and use that or that's used functionally in the response. So make sure to include that appropriately, be accurate, obviously, and provide that range where necessary and where appropriate. But that concludes the breakdown of the question types that are going to be experienced or proposed in section 1 or part 1 of the speaking portion of the exam. Now, again, as you've noticed, hopefully you have, because we did speak quite at length with all of these question types, they all follow essentially the same structure. Introductory phrases, linking phrases, first points, linking phrases, first reasons, following points and reasons with appropriate linking phrases, so on and so forth. Some get a little bit more complex than others, so definitely take the time to familiarize yourself with how to approach some of the more complex questions, like question type 6, yes or no questions, question type 5, WH or how often questions, so you can provide appropriate responses when you get asked questions such as this. But for the most part, sticking to this formula is going to provide you the opportunity to consistently have all the necessary attributes in your answer to hit your good marks in all 4 categories or all 4 assessment criteria. Again, fluency and coherence, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, and pronunciation. The structure is made in such a way to maintain all of those attributes through any one of your answers. And again, this structure is just a guideline for the most part. We're not saying it's the exact correct way to do it, but in following the structure, you're going to maintain all the things that you need, or you're going to have all the things that you need to achieve that band, achieve that score that you're looking for. So obviously my suggestion is to stick to it. And there is some wiggle room. There is a little bit of leeway for you to take it as you want, but for the most part, it's got everything that you need there. So use it. You have the opportunity there. I gave it to you. So hopefully that all makes sense. And that you followed along quite well, took plenty of notes. But in any case, moving forward, we're going to have our next a video here, which is going to talk about part 2. So definitely familiarize yourself with everything that was mentioned here today or during this video, because we are going to break it down essentially further and implement it into the part 2 style questions or type questions in part 2 of the speaking portion of the exam. But in any case, thank you very much for joining me. I hope you can join me in the next video as well. Bye-bye.